and welcome back to my channel. It has been a hot minute, and actually, after looking at the date stamp of my most recent video, I realized that it's actually been about 4 years worth of hot minutes since I have been sitting here talking, sharing with you all in front of the camera, and to say I'm excited to be back would be an understatement. I do want to give a special shout out before we dive into today's video to those of you who left comments on my previous nonviolent communication videos, who got the dialogue started, and those of you who actually reached out to me via direct message, both on Instagram and here on YouTube, asking where this video was. So again, if you got the notification, here it is, and I am so sorry it took 4 years to finalize this little mini series on nonviolent communication. And that's actually one of the reasons that this is my first video back, because I felt that I couldn't leave y'all hanging, those of you who reached out to me. But like I said, if you're new here, welcome. And there are 3 videos prior to this one that I definitely recommend you go check out and watch. They will be linked in the description box below, and I'll try to throw up a little link right here for you to click on also. And with that, we are going to dive into today's topic, which is the 4th piece of the nonviolent communication process, which is making requests. I thought we would first start out by doing a little recap of steps 1 through 3. Step 1 being making observations, step 2 being identifying feelings, and step 3 being communicating needs. Making requests is ultimately about trying to determine how likely it is that you are going to get your needs met. And this happens by making a request of somebody and checking in on their willingness to meet your needs, or their willingness to complete an action that's been requested of them. That willingness piece that I just mentioned is a really important part of making requests. So when you ask something of somebody, you are asking about their willingness to meet your needs or their willingness to complete an action. For example, that might sound like, would you be willing to unload the dishwasher? Or would you be willing to lead the meeting at work tomorrow? And with nonviolent communication, there is a focus on differentiating between demands and requests. And Marshall Rosenberg actually has a really interesting story about his experience with demands and requests in the classroom. He recounts a situation where he has been invited to teach nonviolent communication in a classroom. And I believe this was a high school classroom. And some of these students were talking, being loud, not sitting in their seats. And so he makes a request of them. And I'm paraphrasing here, but it sounds something like, would you be willing to sit in your seats for the next 15 minutes? After some back and forth, I think they finally end up sitting down, and he asks them, can you all repeat back to me what you heard me say? One of the students spoke up and said, you told us that we had to sit down. That was just an example of how most of us are conditioned to hear demands even when someone is making a request of us. I don't know, I just thought that was very interesting, and something I usually keep in mind for myself going forward in my empathetic communication practices. And something I encourage you to kind of think about too when someone might be making a request of you. And I think the other important part about making requests is that we, as the requester, have to be willing ourselves to hear the word no. And I say that because making a request is not a manipulation tactic to get somebody to do what you want. Keep in mind that no can be valuable information from the other person. Getting a no means that yes is going to interfere with the other person's needs, and that's okay. By making a request, that's going to be an opportunity for you to have maybe more dialogue about the topic instead of making a demand, which might close things off if you do happen to receive a no. And then one tip I have for making requests is to try and make the request using as specific language as possible, and also making the request something doable and reasonable. For example, it's very unreasonable and unrealistic to say something like, would you be willing to keep your room clean at all times? That's an impossible task and not very realistic, and probably will result in closed off communication. So again, whatever the situation is, whatever you're practicing when it comes to nonviolent communication, try to make it as specific, or use as specific language as possible, and make it something realistic and doable for the other individual. And finally, I want to acknowledge that it can be, and probably will be, very difficult and challenging at first, shifting from making demands to making requests. And I think this probably happens way more often with individuals who are in positions of power over somebody else. So whether that's a boss and an employee, or a parent and a child, one suggestion I would have is to just start with some mindfulness around demands and requests, and just start to be on the lookout for and keep your ears open for how often you hear demands versus how often you hear requests, not only from other people, but also how often you're making demands versus making requests. And I think that awareness is a good first step if you are looking to make that shift. And I also wanted to provide you with a couple of examples so you can hear what this might sound like in some real life scenarios. An example of a demand might be, don't ever leave your dirty clothes on the floor, versus, would you be willing to tidy up your dirty laundry every other day? That might be a little bit more realistic, a little bit more doable. Of course, it's always going to depend on the person. Or another example of a request in that situation might sound like, would you be willing to have a chat with me for maybe 5 minutes to talk about how I might be able to help you strategize about keeping the dirty laundry tidy? I know that was a bit of a mouthful, but that's just another example of a request, and a request where you are offering some help as well to the other person. A workplace example might sound as simple as, finish that report by 5 o'clock. That's the demand. Versus a request might sound something like, hey, would you be willing to have a 5-minute huddle with me so we can chat about how I can help you get this report out by 5 o'clock today? Maybe that individual got the information they needed for the report at 4:30, so a 5 o'clock deadline is very unreasonable, probably very stressful. A request instead opens up the line of communication, shows empathy, which again, we'll talk about in a minute here, but is at the core of nonviolent communication, and hopefully evolves into a situation where both individuals are going to get their needs met. The requester is going to have the report go out in a time that they need it to go out, and the person who's having the request made of them is able to leave work at a reasonable hour to meet their need of taking care of their children or getting home to their pet or their spouse or something like that. So again, just a couple of really simple examples to see how that might play out in the real world. And right about now, you might be thinking to yourself, this sounds really, really formulaic. Make the observations, identify the feelings, state the need, make the request. And you would be absolutely correct. That does sound very formulaic. And we're not robots, or at least most of us aren't. And we don't want to sound robotic or inhuman when we're trying to connect with people on a deeper level and have more empathy for people. So I encourage you to start with one piece and kind of see how that feels for you. Maybe you start at the beginning and you start with having some mindfulness around making observations versus making judgments. When other people do it, when you do it to yourself, because that can be very important too. Or maybe you start at the end and you start by having some mindfulness around requests versus demands. And then I think you'll find that over time, after working on each one of those pieces, you will find your own flow when it comes to nonviolent communication. And it does not have to be this very robotic, formulaic situation. Now I'll just leave you with a few of my final thoughts. The first being that I really want to emphasize that this video and my previous 3 videos on nonviolent communication are a very brief summary of this topic. And there are a lot of nuances that I did not cover. And that's because my goal here is to expose you to these types of topics, give you a brief overview, and hopefully encourage your own further exploration and practice. Or if nothing else, maybe just pique your curiosity a little bit or plant a seed here and there. And last but not least, I want to emphasize the idea of intention when it comes to nonviolent communication. So NVC is not, I repeat, not a manipulation tool to get others to do what you want them to do. Marshall Rosenberg makes it very clear in his book, in his courses, in his teachings, that we really have to be mindful of our intention when we engage in practices like nonviolent communication. Nonviolent communication is a way to connect with others more deeply and more empathetically. It is not a tactic to control or manipulate other people. So I just wanted to make that very clear as well. Not that I expected any of you were to necessarily think like that, but I think it's good that we're all mindful of that, as we learn more about these types of practices. And if I have, in fact, piqued your interest about nonviolent communication, I have put together some resources and tools, and they will be linked in the description box below. So definitely go check those out. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them as best I can. I am not an expert by any stretch of the imagination on this topic, but I would love to get some dialogue going if you're interested. If you have any experience with nonviolent communication, if you've practiced anything from videos 1 through 3, or if you've practiced from this video and have come back to share your experience, I would love to hear about it. I've also linked the new Living Well in a Wild Instagram and Etsy shop in the description box below. I invite you to check those out as well. Again, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with me today. For those of you, again, who subscribed 4 years ago and were wondering where this video is, I want to thank you so much again for your patience. Glad to have you back. I'm glad to be back, and let's keep it going. May you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be safe, and may you live your life in peace and ease. Take care of yourselves, be well, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.